Imagine discovering that your last name is not a family legacy at all. Imagine learning that it was assigned to a newborn by a stranger because no one knew who the parents were. Imagine realizing that the name you carry today might actually be the record of a moment when a baby was left behind in silence. Welcome to Biography Plus. Before we begin, picture a wall built into the side of an old stone building somewhere in medieval Europe. At night, the street is quiet. A woman approaches the wall carrying a wrapped infant. She looks around to make sure no one is watching. Her hands are shaking. In the wall, there is a small wooden cylinder. It turns like a barrel built into the stone. She places the baby inside, whispers something only the child can hear, and pushes the wheel. The cylinder rotates. Inside the building, a bell rings. By the time someone opens the inner door, the woman is gone forever. For more than 6 centuries, this mechanism quietly processed millions of children across Europe, and the evidence of that system still exists today, hidden in the surnames of millions of people. Names like Esposito, Trovato, Innocenti, and Proietti. Each one carries the memory of a child who was left in a rotating wheel built into a wall. The system had a name in Italian, the ruota degli esposti, the wheel of the exposed. Its origins trace back to the late 12th century when the powerful church leader Pope Innocent III confronted a grim reality in the city of Rome. Infants were being discovered in shocking numbers along the banks of the Tiber River. Many desperate mothers, facing social disgrace or poverty, believed they had no choice but to abandon their children in secret. The wheel offered anonymity. A mother could surrender a baby without revealing her identity. No one would ask questions. The child would be taken inside by the church or hospital and, in theory, cared for. The idea spread quickly through Catholic Europe. By the late Middle Ages, these wheels appeared in cities across the continent. They were installed in hospitals, monasteries, and churches. From Florence to Naples, from Paris to Vienna, they became part of the architecture of charity. A mother approached the building from the outside. She placed the child inside the rotating cylinder. She turned it, a bell rang, and the baby vanished into the institution. The intention was mercy, but the reality was often far darker. One of the most famous institutions connected to this system still stands today in Florence. The Ospedale degli Innocenti opened in the 15th century as the first purpose-built Foundling Hospital in Europe. Its elegant Renaissance facade was designed by the architect Filippo Brunelleschi, the same genius who designed Florence's great cathedral dome. Behind those beautiful arches, however, unfolded a very different story. When the hospital opened in 1445, the first infant admitted was a girl named Agata. At first, the institution received a few hundred children each year, but the numbers rose rapidly as word spread that the wheel existed. Within decades, hundreds of infants arrived annually. Eventually, the number reached thousands, and many of them did not survive. Infant mortality in the pre-modern world was already tragically high, but conditions in foundling hospitals often made survival even less likely. Overcrowding, disease, and limited resources created environments where illness spread quickly. Some records from the 18th and 19th centuries show mortality rates approaching 90% during particularly difficult periods. The hospitals depended on wet nurses to feed the babies. These women were often recruited from the same impoverished communities where the children themselves were born. The system created an uncomfortable paradox. A mother could abandon her child in the wheel and then be hired by the same institution to nurse someone else's baby. The woman might earn wages feeding another infant while being forbidden from caring for her own. The institution that separated families sometimes relied on those same mothers for labor. The story was not confined to Italy. In England, a similar effort emerged in the 18th century when the philanthropist Thomas Coram campaigned for nearly 2 decades to establish a home for abandoned children in London. His persistence eventually succeeded when George III of Great Britain granted a royal charter allowing the creation of the Foundling Hospital. The hospital opened in 1741 and initially accepted small numbers of children selected by lottery. But in 1756, the British government introduced a policy known as the General Reception. Under this program, the hospital was required to accept every child brought to its doors. Within just 4 years, nearly 15,000 infants were admitted. The institution simply could not handle the numbers. Disease spread rapidly, resources collapsed, and mortality rates soared. Eventually, the policy was abandoned, but thousands of children had already passed through the system. Across Europe, similar institutions struggled with the same dilemma. Their purpose was to save lives, yet the sheer volume of abandoned infants often overwhelmed the care available. Transportation itself could be dangerous. In rural regions, intermediaries carried babies long distances to reach foundling hospitals in major cities. Some infants traveled for days in wagons or baskets before reaching their destination. Many arrived already ill. In Dublin, the Dublin Foundling Hospital became notorious for the scale of its tragedy. Over roughly a century of operation, it admitted well over 100,000 children. A very large percentage of those infants died during childhood. Parliamentary inquiries in the 18th and 19th centuries exposed severe problems within the institution, including overcrowded wards and poor sanitation. Yet the hospital continued operating for decades. Despite the grim statistics, the mothers who approached the wheels rarely intended abandonment in the cruel sense of the word. Many believed they were giving their children the only chance at survival they could imagine. Before placing the baby into the wheel, mothers often left a small token with the child. These tokens are among the most haunting artifacts preserved from the entire system. A coin cut in half, a ribbon, a coral bead, a piece of embroidered cloth. Sometimes the token was divided into 2 parts. The mother kept one half while the baby was left with the other, creating a possible proof of identity in case she ever returned. Thousands of these objects survive today in archives and museums. At the Foundling Museum and in the archives of the Ospedale degli Innocenti, visitors can see drawers filled with these tiny pieces of history. Each object represents a moment of separation that took place centuries ago. One piece of fabric preserved in Florence carries 2 embroidered French words, cruelle séparation, cruel separation. It is a message left by a mother who knew she might never see her child again. Even the names given to abandoned infants reflected the system that received them. In Naples, the surname Esposito became extremely common. The word literally means exposed or placed outside. In Sicily, many foundlings received the name Trovato, meaning found. In parts of central Italy, children were given the name Proietti, derived from the Latin word meaning thrown forward or cast out. At the Florence Hospital, many children were named Innocenti, after the institution itself. These names gradually spread through generations as the children grew up, married, and formed families of their own. Centuries later, they remain among the most common surnames in Italy. For many people, those names mark the point where their family history suddenly goes silent. Genealogists often call it a brick wall, a place where the records stop and the lineage cannot be traced further back. But in reality, the wall was sometimes quite literal, a stone wall with a rotating wheel built into it. By the 19th century, attitudes toward the foundling system began to change. Reformers increasingly argued that the wheels encouraged abandonment rather than preventing it. Governments started closing them. In Italy, many of the wheels were sealed during the 1860s and 1870s as new social policies attempted to provide support for struggling mothers rather than separating families. Studies examining these closures later found something striking. Abandonment rates often fell once the wheels disappeared. Without the anonymous mechanism available, communities began searching for other solutions. The last wheel in Florence was sealed in 1875. A plaque marks the date today. The building still stands, transformed into a museum and cultural institution. Visitors walk through its quiet courtyards without always realizing the history embedded in its walls. But the legacy of the Foundling Wheels did not disappear when the mechanisms were closed. It lives on in archives filled with tokens, in documents recording the lives of abandoned children, and most visibly, in the surnames that continue to appear across Europe. Millions of people carry those names today. Most have no idea that the name on their passport or mailbox might once have been assigned to a newborn placed into a rotating wooden wheel centuries ago. A simple family name can sometimes hold the memory of a silent moment outside a church wall when a desperate parent made an impossible decision. History often survives in grand monuments and famous events, but sometimes it survives in quieter ways, in a piece of cloth preserved in a drawer, in a hospital record written hundreds of years ago, or in a surname passed from generation to generation, long after the wheel that created it stopped turning.